Well, good morning and welcome to Wake Up in the Word. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to be looking at the oldest psalm in the Bible, the oldest psalm in the Bible, which you might be surprised to find all the way over at Psalm 90. For some of you might be thinking, well, aren't the Psalms in order? Not the order that you might think. The Psalms are designed according to books of the Pentateuch, whether they're Genesis, Exodus, Levitical, Numbers, Psalms, so because of that, they're arranged according to the book of the Bible they relate to. So today we're going to discover the oldest psalm in the Bible as we look at Psalm 90. Thank you for joining me. As we look at this psalm, the background of it is like this. It's a psalm of Moses. In fact, several of these may be attributed to Moses, but this one in particular is one that is definitely attributed as the very first psalm of Moses. Genesis had not yet been published. Moses may well have already written Genesis, perhaps Leviticus, Exodus, parts of Numbers, but these works were not yet in circulation. So, thus, Psalm 90 stands in the grand isolation of being the oldest psalm in history, one of the grandest psalms ever penned, and the first great masterpiece of the Hebrew hymn book. As we set the stage for that, we have to recognize where Moses was when he wrote this psalm. The nation of Israel had been wandering through the wilderness. They had come to Kadesh Barnea. They were ready to go into the promised land, supposedly, and they send in the 12 spies. You remember what happened. The spies came back, and 10 had a negative report. The land, they said, was a dreadful place, full of great fenced cities inhabited by giants, dreadful sons of Anakim. They said, we can't go in. We look like grasshoppers in front of these people. We're scared to death. No, it can't be done. Does that sound familiar? Those same kind of voices often raise their heads when any act of faith is proposed. But two men brought in a minority report. They said, look, it's a good land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. And if we've got our eyes on God, God says to go in, we should go in, understanding it's His strength and His providence that will prevail. But the majority ruled. Fear drove out faith. The tribes elected not to even attempt to conquer Canaan, and God allowed them now to suffer the consequences of their choice. Everyone over 20 years of age would perish in the wilderness. The terror by night, the arrow by day, the pestilence in the darkness, the destruction at noonday, the lion and the adder would all take their toll. John Phillips puts it thus: it was the sentence of death on a whole generation. Instead of the promised land, it will be the desert sand. Instead of the conquest of Canaan, there would be woe in the wilderness. So from then on, Israel marched, but she marched without point or purpose. The Israelites simply moved from place to place, leaving behind them a trail of bones in desolate graves hollowed in the sand. They wandered thus for 40 years, a year for every day the spies were in Canaan. God held over the unbelieving people a sandglass of 40 years, during which every man and woman of the older generation would perish. With that kind of setting, then we understand a little bit of the tone, should we say, of this psalm, Psalm 90. It's one we use some of its verses, perhaps in funeral services, as we recognize the temporal nature of our lives, but yet the grace of God. It begins thus in Psalm 90. I'm reading out of the Holman Christian Standard Bible this morning. Lord, you have been our refuge in every generation. Before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from eternity to eternity, you are God. You return mankind to the dust, saying, return, descendants of Adam, for in your sight 1,000 years are like yesterday that passes by, like a few hours of the night. You end their lives, they sleep. They are like grass that grows in the morning. In the morning it sprouts and grows. By evening it withers and dries up. For we are consumed by your anger. We are terrified by your wrath. You have set our unjust ways before you, our secret sins, in the light of your presence. For all our days ebb away under your wrath. We end our years like a sigh. Our lives last 70 years, or if we are strong, 80. But even the best of them are struggle and sorrow. Indeed, they pass quickly, and we fly away. Who understands the power of your anger? Your wrath matches the fear that is due you. So teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. Lord, how long? Turn and have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your faithful love, so that we may shout with joy and be glad all of our days. Make us rejoice for as many days as you have humbled us, for as many years as we have seen adversity. Let your work be seen by your servants, and your splendor by their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be on us. Establish for us the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. A beautiful psalm that lets us know that life is short. It is a life of brevity. In the New Testament, James says it's like a vapor that appears for a while and then vanishes away. Yet those days are ours, and prayerfully they'll be consumed by wisdom, by learning, by worship, connecting with the Lord our God, and recognizing how we should pass these truths along to the next generation. That's why that verse number 12 that sticks right in the middle of this psalm seems to be so important to us even to this day. So, Lord, we close with this prayer. Would you teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts? Thank you for joining me today. Let's do this again tomorrow as we wake up in the Word.